So for this session, we're going to talk directly about animal rights and the way in which it intersects with issues within mainly contemporary art and the use of both living and dead animals. So the way I have this structured is for the first half we talk about, and I introduce you to some current or let's say modern animal rights theories, so animal rights theories from the past 40 years or so. And then after that, it's going to be very rudimentary. It's going to be very, very quick. So if you're interested in these rights theories, just go out and look up some of these names. They're all very famous people. In one case, there's a documentary film that I show you a trailer for, so you can watch that whole thing. These are all fascinating theories to learn about. Then the second half, we're going to try to apply it to specific examples of contemporary art. And so first off, I have to say that when I was younger, I never thought about animal rights. I never thought about animals, really, growing up. It wasn't until I took a bioethics class in college where I was confronted with these issues, and then I started thinking about them, and then it changed. I was exposed to certain ideas that led me to think a bit further about the way we use animals, about animal rights. So if this is all new to you, as it was to me when I was younger, don't feel judged. Just treat it as exposure to new ideas and a chance and an opportunity to think further about some of these issues, which are very important. So without further ado, let's get into art of animal rights. And for this session, I always start with a film. You're going to see that I'm a big fan of lots of different things, and one of my other loves is film and the history of film. And so I like to plug this movie that came out in 2014 called Under the Skin. Maybe you saw it. It has Scarlett Johansson in it, so a very famous person. But the film itself was a bit more, let's say, indie, a little too strange for more mainstream audiences, so I don't think it was a huge hit. But it's a fantastic film, especially if you like science fiction. I highly recommend watching this film. And it was actually a book before it was made into a film, and the book is also good. It's just called Under the Skin. So check that out too if you like reading science fiction. But the reason I bring in this film for the first part of this class is that it gets us to a hypothetical that's troubled some recent philosophers, and it creates a really interesting thought experiment for us. So you just need to know that the premise of this film, I'm not going to spoil too much, but the premise is that Scarlett Johansson is an alien, and then she's sent on a mission to Earth, basically to start harvesting people in order to process their bodies, in order to consume them, or to use their bodies in various ways. And so the film leads us to this rather powerful hypothetical that some philosophers and some ethicists have brought up. And it's an interesting question. When we have an actual discussion in a live class, this leads to usually about a good half hour of discussion and debate, and it leads us to all sorts of interesting places. But the hypothetical here would be, suppose that a superior species of beings came to our planet, and they were both more powerful than us, than human beings, and much smarter, more intelligent than us. They would then communicate to us and say, because they're more powerful, they're stronger, and they're smarter, that justifies their using us in various ways. That we clearly would prefer not to be used in those ways, right? We even if we don't speak and say, please don't do this, they might not even understand our language, right? They might not understand English or French or German or whatever language you might pick that's a human language. They might not understand it, but they might very well understand like the way we resist, the way we even physically resist, right? And so then the crucial question is, would these superior beings, would these aliens have the right to do this, right? The knee-jerk response, usually I think, is to say, no, they wouldn't have the right. Like just because they're smarter than us and just because they're more powerful, they'd have to have some sort of argument, right? Where some sort of sound argumentation to justify using us in some ways. But even then, I think it's not something we would really gladly acquiesce to, right? And so I think you see where this hypothetical gets us. It gets us to the very core of what it means to have a right over something else or over someone else. When you consider yourself to be smarter or when you consider yourself to be more powerful. And it gets us to these old debates about whether or not might makes right, right? That's a mouthful. But so these get us to very interesting questions. And then, of course, I think it's probably not lost on you that this hypothetical is more or less gets to the essence of the relationship that humans have with non-human animals, right? That most people think that they have a superior position over animals, that they're both more powerful, although usually, sometimes that's not the case, but often it is. But almost always, it's deemed that humans are more intelligent than other animals, and that might very well be the case. But what some of the animal theorists will talk about is the fact that just because you're more intelligent than a cat or a cow or a pig or a chicken or even like maybe even an insect, right? That doesn't necessarily give you justification, right? That doesn't give you a claim. That's not really a sound argument. And there have been all sorts of troubling moments in history where certain humans thought they were more intelligent than other humans, like even within our species, and that sort of was turned into a justification for certain types of discrimination and certain types of exploitation. So we're in very difficult waters here with this hypothetical, and we're sort of confronted with the very notion of what a right is and what it means to have a scenario where perceived superiority in itself becomes a justification for an action or for discrimination, right? So it's a very compelling hypothetical. I'm not going to go over it too much longer because otherwise we'll be here all day talking about it. But if this is something you choose to write about in as part of your week essay for this first week, it can take you to some very interesting places. I've only just hit the tip of the iceberg on this hypothetical. Okay, so let's go through a few of the prominent modern animal rights theories. Obviously, the philosophers all the way back in non-Western traditions and in Western traditions, Greeks and pre-Socratics have been thinking about animals, but we're only going to be talking about modern animal rights theories. And for the most part, it's widely considered that Peter Singer and his book Animal Liberation from 1975, this is the book that I read when I was in a bioethics class, and it completely opened my eyes and forced me to think about the way in which animals are treated and used. This is usually thought to be or nominated as the beginnings of the modern animal rights movement in ethical philosophy and in activism as well. It's a seminal text even for animal activists. And Peter Singer is a utilitarian. So utilitarian actually doesn't even believe in rights. So this gets a little tricky, right? How is this book, Animal Liberation, the founding book of the modern animal rights movement? It's a little bit of an irony that a utilitarian does not believe in inherent rights. A utilitarian will think that something is good if it leads to well-being, and something is bad if it leads to harm, right? And so for Singer, the key question, which is interesting coming off of the hypothetical where we were talking about power and intelligence, he says that those things don't matter. Intelligence does not matter when you're considering the value of another creature. What matters is whether or not they can suffer, whether or not they can feel pain. And there's another term for this within ethical thought, and you may have heard this term before. It's called sentience. So the ability to feel pain, the ability to have nerve endings, the ability to experience your life as compromised, That's the fundamental question for moral philosophy, for Peter Singer, and for a utilitarian. And so what matters for Singer, for both human and non-human animals, is that we're sentient and we can feel pain. And so for a utilitarian, acting morally is almost like an equation. It's like an economy. So acting morally and ethically means to do those things that minimize suffering as much as possible. And usually it gets more complicated than this, but usually it'll be a question of, does my well-being, if I do this, outweigh the harm that it causes? Or does my action, which might be good for me, lead to a much further harm? So it's almost like think of a balance where you have good and then you have harm. You have pleasure and then you have suffering, right? So if whatever pleasure you get from acting a certain way, if it pales in comparison to the damage and the suffering that leads to, for a utilitarian, this will be immoral. This is not the action you should be taking. And so you can apply this to all sorts of things. Someone might take pleasure in torturing a cat, which is a game that kids used to play long time ago, centuries ago. Whatever pleasure a young boy, or maybe young girl, but usually it's young boys, whatever pleasure might be gained from torturing a cat is outweighed by the suffering that the cat goes through. The suffering is greater than the good. This also applies to food. If you don't need, unless you're starving and have no access to any other forms of food, if you eat a hamburger simply because it's what you like and you feel pleasure, even though you have other options available, for utilitarian, the utilitarian will say that brief moment of pleasure of taste, of those 5 minutes, pale in comparison to the suffering of the cow, the animal that had to be rendered into that piece of food. Right? This is how utilitarians think. It's a balancing act of pain and pleasure, of well-being and suffering. And so for utilitarian, there are no inherent rights, because while it's pretty hard to argue that getting pleasure from a chicken nugget outweighs the suffering that the chicken goes through, especially in like a factory farm. It gets much grayer when you're talking about things like animal experimentation. So what if you kill 5 monkeys in an experiment in order to get a vaccine for COVID? A utilitarian might come along and argue that the suffering that those monkeys go through over the course of this experiment is nothing compared to the well-being of humanity if they finally get a vaccine for this miserable virus that's killing so many people, right? So their utilitarian will probably say, or will have to say, that the good that leads from the suffering outweighs it, right? Now, whether or not there are alternatives, a utilitarian might say, yes, the suffering is probably lesser than the good that you would get from a vaccine, but that's only if there are no alternatives, right? And you have some scientists and some bioethicists who are working on either less invasive forms of experimentation on animals, or modeling that experimentation through computers and through non-animal models, right? As a way to just get out of this moral conundrum that we're in. But all this is just an example to say that for utilitarian, it's not inherent rights, right? For each case, you have to weigh the good and the bad, the suffering and the pleasure and the well-being, right? Another important term that comes out of this book is speciesism, which is coined by someone else named Ryder, but Peter Singer's the one who really makes it quite famous. And this goes along with his theories. He says to disregard or downplay animal suffering as unimportant is a form of discrimination called speciesism. Speciesism will also be used to describe discrimination within the animal kingdom, right? So privileging or adopting or loving one type of animal, but then committing acts of violence or killing or whatever it might be, whether it's in food industries or whatever it might be, another type of animal. So like in Western culture, at least in the United States and Europe, usually dogs are pets. They're loved, and then pigs are rarely pets, although people do have pigs as pets, and they're killed and eaten, right? For Singer, that's a form of discrimination because there's no moral difference really between a dog and a pig. They're both sentient creatures that have lives, that think, and that they're actually quite intelligent, even though a utilitarian like Singer would say intelligence doesn't really enter the equation. So that's an introduction to utilitarian philosophy for animal ethics. A lot more to be said about it. But again, email me if you want any more sources, or just, Singer's very famous, so look up a lecture of his. He's a compelling, sometimes controversial thinker, but a compelling thinker, a very important one. So the other one, the other seminal moment in modern animal rights is a book by Tom Regan, The Case for Animal Rights. And here's where we get to a true rights theory, someone who says that by virtue of what they are, animals have rights. Non-human animals, like human animals, have inherent moral worth because they're quote-unquote subjects of life. This is a term from Regan. They have a thing that is themselves, that it is to be what they are. They are a subject for themselves. They are a subject of life. And so what is a subject of life? What is this thing for Regan that leads to an inherent moral worth, like being born into an inherent moral worth, into rights? And it's really the whole spectrum of what it is to exist as a creature. It's to have desire, it's to have perception, it's to have memory, it's to have an emotional life, it's the ability to feel pleasure and pain, it's to have psychological identity over time, and it's in general to have preferences and interests, which includes the desire to remain alive, but also desires and interests to be part of a community, to be part of a pack, to live a life according to a certain amount of dignity with respect to that species, right? So it'll change. And a psychological identity over time might not apply to all animals. Like the verdict is still out on insects, right? And certain much lower forms of animal life. Think of like mollusks or mussels or something like that. But certainly we know today that birds, all mammals, probably fish, have a psychological identity over time. They do feel pleasure and pain. They do think. They do have perceptions. They have desires, and they have memories. And so for Regan, by virtue of what these things are on this planet, they have inherent moral worth. They have to have rights. And so, in short, many, again, perhaps not all, because this might not apply to certain. I just had an insect walk on my hand. Speaking of, this might not apply to every single creature that we've categorized as an animal, but for a good majority of animals, they are going to have preference autonomy, which just simply means the preference to be able to do what one wants to do, as long as it doesn't get in the way of other rights, right? Especially human rights. And they should be considered moral patients. So this is a form of rights theory that comes from the bottom up, from the inherent capabilities of the rights holder in question. Now, this doesn't mean that non-human animals will need to have like the right to vote, or the right to drive a car, or the right to whatever other types of rights that within a human community we've given ourselves. Even though not equally yet. Hopefully one day it'll be equal. These are not those kind of rights. These are rights that sync up and that correspond with the type of being that this whichever animal whichever animal is. Right? So this is Regan's theory of rights, which is an inherent animal rights model. Like animals have inherent rights. Then you have a more recent approach, which is called the abolitionist approach, which is not without controversy. I'll talk about it in a moment. But an abolitionist will, like abolitionists from the 19th century who wanted to abolish human slavery, the key thing there was to not treat humans as property. This is the great horror and wrong of human slavery, that you would treat any human being as simply a piece of property, right? So you have certain animal rights theorists like Gary Francione who says, this is wonderful that this happened, that we had this abolitionist movement. Now we need to move on and abolish the property status of animals. Not only humans shouldn't be used as property, but animals also should not be used as property. That's the abolitionist argument. And in some ways it's much more, their form of argumentation is much more like commonsensical, and it's less like highfalutin theory like Singer, like utilitarian, or Regan. Francione presents this in a very commonsensical way, and usually he'll present it in this following way that I'm going to give you. He says that we all agree, almost everyone agrees, that it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering or death, right? So like torturing cats for fun. I mean, it's hard to find someone today, you might be able to, but for most of us, if we saw someone torturing a cat for fun, we would think, well, that's wrong. You got to stop that. Like it's just unnecessary. It's not leading to anything other than suffering and death. And again, whatever pleasure is gleaned from it is negligible. And in fact, we would probably say that type of pleasure is inherently immoral. So for an abolitionist, it follows that it's wrong to inflict suffering or death on animals, or to have someone else do it, right? Merely because we derive pleasure or amusement from it, or for these other reasons that are equally unjustifiable, which is convenience. It's just more convenient for me to torture a cat than it is to, like go inside and have to turn on the computer and play a video game instead, right? That could be an argument from convenience. That just doesn't hold up very well. Or simply because it's habit or tradition. That also doesn't hold up within a court of law and within ethical reasoning. Just because kids for a long time tortured cats in the 19th century, 18th century, and before, just because there is a tradition of this doesn't mean that it's okay, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay. You need some other form of argumentation to justify it. And so the consequence of this for an abolitionist is that the overwhelming portion of animal use, especially in the developed world, so-called developed world, there are problems with this theory when you apply it to like subsistence farmers somewhere in the so-called developing world, right? Where their daily lives may very well need to have, they may very well need to use an animal in some sort of way to survive. The abolitionist theory has a difficult time with that kind of scenario, but for our purposes, for people living in the United States, and even there might be some issues, people living in food deserts and that sort of thing, right? But for most people living in the United States, the overwhelming use of animals can't be justified by anything other than pleasure, amusement, convenience, or habit. And so, for example, food, right? This is one of the big, I think it's gone very mainstream now to have debates as to what types of foods we should be eating, what's best for the environment, what's the most ethical, so on and so forth. So much has changed in the past 10 years. Now that it's pretty much widely known that a plant-based diet is adequate for human health, and in fact, every month you have more and more studies, and the World Health Organization, and all sorts of even very official institutions saying that actually it's probably much better for human health, right? The justification of using an animal then for food it can't be justified by anything other than pleasure, amusement, convenience, or habit, according to an abolitionist, right? And so, therefore, for an abolitionist, using animals as mere property or exploited resources almost always unjustifiable and needs to be abolished. So you see, this is much more of almost a commonsensical approach to animal rights, one that hinges on it actually hinges on the word unnecessary in so many ways, right? And that's something you could actually maybe even write about in your response if you're interested in this theory. I already mentioned the issue inherent to this theory when it comes to certain places in the world where human economies, human cultures would disappear or necessarily do need to, in some ways, exploit animals. So think of, there was this incredible movie about a fishing community in the Brazilian Amazon, where the only economy they had and the only way they could subsist was to hunt a certain type of fish, which then became endangered. It was put on the endangered list, and their livelihood was compromised. Right. So this is an issue. But the other issue with the abolitionist approach is that it assumes that human slavery, that abolition, is something that's done and finished historically. And a lot of race studies theorists who are sympathetic to animal rights point out that this is far from the case. Not only do we not have, clearly, we don't have equal rights at the level of race in this country, in the way people are treated according to and discriminated according to the color of their skin, but we still have human slavery in this world. You have human slaves who are used on shrimping boats off of Thailand. You have human slaves, and I mean like literally slaves, people who are forced to work and not paid. We still have this form of slavery in the global economy. And so for some, it rubs the wrong way to start thinking about abolitionism when it comes to animal use, when we still haven't reached full abolition when it comes to the use of humans, right? So these are all very difficult questions that we're raising here. Important questions, but difficult questions. Okay, so a few more things before we get to some of the works. I just gave you 3 animal rights theories. I tried to give them to you in a way that's neutral, that tries to show their strong points and then maybe their weak points, maybe the ways in which they can be critiqued. Something you can do in your writing as you talk about those theories and some of the works that we're about to look at. Now we're going to move towards some examples. And so I do want to mention, as we move towards our first example, which is a film, that in 1978, and it was announced in 1978, but then put into the books in 1990 in UNESCO headquarters in Paris, there is a Universal Declaration of Animal Rights. There's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that is pronounced right at the end of World War II. And I think a lot of people know about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you don't, then you should go look it up and read it. But there was also a Universal Declaration of Animal Rights pronounced in 1978. And this would become influential and will become a model for other legal frameworks around the world. One was in the Spanish Parliament in 2008, called the Grade 8 Project, which argued for a certain type of animal rights, which are very close to the Universal Declaration of Animal Rights and close to what Regan was arguing for. So the first was a right to life, which means members of the community may not be killed except in very strictly defined circumstances, like such as self-defense, right? So the right to life is a right that certain animals should have. in the Great Ape Project, they limited the right to primates, to apes, right, who are very close to us. We're primates, actually, and chimpanzees have nearly the same DNA that humans have. We're like 98, 99% the same DNA. We've come to find. So the Great Ape Project was arguing for a species of animal that's very close to us, right? So a right to life, but also a protection of individual liberty. So to forbid imprisonment without due process, and imprisoning an individual only if it seems to be for their own good or to protect the public. And also the prohibition of torture, which forbids the deliberate, infliction of pain on a member of that community. And so it's interesting. I've given you some of these animal rights theories that sound like they're in the abstract, but we have had moments where these animal rights theories, in a more restricted way, they'll usually apply to only higher level animals like apes, like cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and so on and so forth, or elephants. But they have been deployed within an official legal system, right? It's very, very interesting. And just a couple years ago, for the first time ever, there was an orangutan in Argentina who was given the right of personhood. So we all have rights of personhood, which is very close to these rights that are enunciated in the Great Ape Project. And for the first time ever, a non-human animal, this orangutan in Argentina, was given the right of personhood. Which brings us to the film that I want to show you, at least the trailer. It's called the Non-Human Rights Project, and it's headed by an animal rights lawyer named Stephen Wise. And he brings cases on behalf of non-human animals, that they should no longer be deemed to be property within the eyes of the law, but that they should be given a certain form of personhood, which again means right to be alive, right to not be imprisoned against one's own will, and right to be protected from torture and from pain, right? And the Non-Human Rights Project, which is ongoing, and they're filing lawsuits on behalf of non-human animals all the time, they restrict their focus to elephants, cetaceans, and primates. But still, it's incredible. These have gone in the court of law. So let me show you this this documentary. It's called Rattling the Cage, and it's about these first legal briefs that were given in court on behalf of these chimpanzees that were living in New York. So let me show you this trailer, and it'll give you a good idea of what it's like.
These animals are extraordinarily cognitively complex. So when you imprison a chimpanzee, the chimpanzee understands that tomorrow he's going to be imprisoned. And as far as he knows, it's not going to end. What we're trying to do is change the way people view non-human animals. Because right now, it's, are you a human? You have rights. You're not a human, you don't. And we're saying that's wrong.
Kind of a bizarre lawsuit with big implications, and the key question is whether a chimp is a person.
Tommy is a legal thing right now and has a right to get out of being held for his entire life in a cage.
When I began, people laughed at me and they barked when I went into a courtroom.
They are not human beings, and putting them on the same legal standing as a human being, that's insanity.
So we may be coming to you to help us in filing an affidavit, talking about the cognitive abilities that would persuade courts.
Question: visitors have balls.
Oh my God. Merlin died last night.
Captivity, it's just killing these guys. So we need to locate every surviving chimpanzee in New York State and file a suit on their behalf. Someone told me you had a monkey.
There's a chimp in there. He's got TV to watch.
Yeah, he won't do much. He just sits there.
It leads the court. Tommy is indeed a person who is entitled.
You assert he's a person. We haven't decided that.
All we can do is kick the first door open.
Mr. Weiss, you want to come to our court and ask for a right that's never been granted in the history of humankind.
It's a hell of a war. There's going to be a lot of battles in the war. But it's time to begin.
So it's a fascinating documentary. If you can find it, I highly recommend watching it. And it also fits really well with our first lecture, because most of what they use in bringing forth these cases of personhood, of non-human personhood, are these ethological, these discoveries that we've had in cognitive ethology of the complex intelligence, language, and emotional and social lives of, in this case, primates. So it's fascinating stuff. So now, like, what we've done a lot. I had to establish a lot of, like, basically the history of animal rights, and I've given to you again in a very quick way, or as quick as I could. I try to be somewhat thorough, but this is still very, in some ways, introductory. But how does this apply to art and contemporary art, and some of the issues that we'll be dealing with? One way to start asking this question is to think of specific moments of controversy, when animals were used, and then their use was protested as wrong, as unethical, as violating certain rights. And a couple years ago, in 2007, this was in New York. This was this is probably now the largest sort of controversy that involved animals, because it was at the Guggenheim. Guggenheim is such a major museum, so visible. But the Guggenheim had put up a show called Art and China After 1989, and some of the works in the show used animals or depicted animals in such a way where it looked like they were causing harm. And so there were a few works. If you're interested in this, go read about it. This is a hypoallergic text that you can find online. It'll go through the controversy for you. So there were a number of works. We don't have time to go through each work. But the work that was probably the most controversial was this work by Xuan Yang and Peng Yu. It's called Dogs That Can't Touch Each Other, from 2003. So it was a video work within the museum. This wasn't restaged in the museum. It's a video work from 2003. And this was a video work of a performance of pit bulls. This was in China, affixed to treadmills, and then basically forced to run at each other until they became completely exhausted. And they lost all energy. And these pit bulls came from, if I remember correctly, they came from a dogfighting ring. And this is the type of training, these type of treadmills are the type of trainings that's used to train pit bulls to become fighters in the pit. That's why they're called pit bulls, even though pit bulls are not. This is also somewhat controversial, and there are debates about this, but it's very likely that pit bulls are not inherently violent, and pit bulls are actually not a breed. There are different types of breeds, and they're very sweet dogs. In any case, so this work was probably the work that troubled the people the most when it came at the Guggenheim. And you even had animal activists sending threats to the museum, maybe even supposedly death threats to the museum. And the work was pulled. They didn't show this work, and they also pulled a few of the other works that involved animals in the show. So this was a moment where the public reacted to works of art that they deemed to be unethical, that they deemed to be cruel. But it was also then a moment of artistic censorship, of works being censored and not shown. And so you can see how within these debates we have a really complicated deadlock between aesthetic freedom, artistic freedom, and moral constraints or ethical constraints or considerations of cruelty. And that's largely how the exhibition, how this scandal played out in the press. So maybe this is something you'll end up writing about in your weekly response. But it was a troubling and pretty fascinating episode of controversy when it came to the use of animals within art. There's another one too from earlier in 2000. There have been a lot. There have been surprisingly more than you might think. So this was another installation from 2000 by the Chilean artist Marco Evaristi. It was basically just a bunch of blenders with live goldfish inside. The blenders were all plugged in, and so the idea was the work like confronted the audience with their own like moral or immoral impulse, seemingly inviting people to turn the blender on and then kill the fish by blending it up, which at least one visitor did do, and thereby killing 2 fish. And after this, there was an uproar, and the museum director was actually accused of animal cruelty, and he was later acquitted. So another moment within contemporary art where the question of animal cruelty came up when being used as a work or within a work. But what about animals that are not alive? Not living dogs that are being arguably mistreated, not living goldfish that are being blended up. But what about a calf and an adult cow being used, their dead bodies being used for works of art? This is what you have in Damien Hirst, who used a lot of animals in his works. He's very famous, so it's likely that many of you will know his work. His most famous work is a shark that's been pickled in formaldehyde. I could have showed you that one, but I show you this one, Mother and Child Divided. So it's kind of the title is cheeky because the mother and the child are both divided. They're like separated from each other, but they're also quite literally cut in half. You can actually walk through these formaldehyde vitrines that they're floating in, and you can see inside their bodies, almost like a taxonomic, like natural history display or something like this, but here used within a contemporary art setting. So this was also not without controversy. But again, but it's kind of interesting because here's where we get back to the idea of like discriminating one scenario from another, or discriminating one species and another. And in this case, like discriminating 2 animals that have been used for art, caring about them, but then not caring about the ways in which these animals are actually used in industry, or that not becoming an issue. Because these 2 animals do come from a dairy industry, from an animal industrial industry, right? So in conversations of this work, it's usually about Hirst being spectacular, Hirst using these bodies, being grotesque, and so on and so forth. But the wider discussion of how these bodies even became available to him, and how, quite honestly, millions, if not billions, of cows are used every year and killed, that doesn't seem to be part of the equation. So thinking within a broader context of the consideration of animals, even animal rights, leads us into towards different questions, right? Then we get to works of art that are a little more gray. Here is a work by the Belgian artist Wim Delvoye. He has worked with live pigs, and what he does, he will tattoo the pigs. So basically, his tattoo, the skin of the pig, becomes the work of art. And then once the pigs die, and this is crucial, they die a natural death. He has a farm in Beijing where all his pigs live happy lives like an animal sanctuary, and they die of natural causes. Once they die, then they can be sold. They become stuffed and they become sold to museums or to collectors. And the tattoo on the pigs are part of the work of art, right? This gets a little bit more gray, right? Because in some ways it could be argued that these pigs, yes, they were used, their bodies were used, but if they wouldn't have become art objects, they would have been pigs within the food industry, and they would have been killed as adolescents, like all pigs are, for their flesh, right? For their bodies. And so there's a way in which Delvoye has saved their lives by treating them, by turning them into tattooed art objects, right? That might be a generous reading of these works. But you have some people who criticize this work and say, well, for one thing, to tattoo a pig, you have to put the pig under anesthesia. And pigs have very sensitive hearts, and anesthesia is very dangerous for pigs to go under. So that's a really risky operation. And other people would say, why don't you just save the pig? Why do you have to do all this to the pig? Why not just save them and then have the sanctuary, right? So again, we have this unstable relationship between what art can do, what art can't do, and the way in which it relates to the larger question of animal industry, right? Interested to hear what you think about Delvoye. And then we'll finish with some works of art that are more clearly about animal rights, where it's not the animal has been used in such a way for an art project where people criticize it and say it's cruel or immoral or unethical. But a lot of these artists make work that in some ways furthers the awareness of some issues that have to do with animals, with ethics, and with rights. So this is a work by a really wonderful artist. His name was Martin Roth. It's a work that's called In October 2014, I Rescued Laboratory Mice So They Could Play Swan Lake. And so what he did, he built this cube, this clear cube, and put all this natural, these stones, this foliage, this dirt. There's a wheel that the mice can play on. And interesting, they've done studies that even mice in the wild will choose to play with the wheel. So like the old cliche of crazy mice inside of cages going around wheels, it's actually, they like it. They actually derive pleasure from it. But so this wheel is hooked up to a little box, a musical box, which plays Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. And the crucial thing to note here is that illegally, actually, he saved these mice from a laboratory. All mice that are used within laboratories have absolutely no rights. They don't. There are anti-cruelty laws, but they don't apply to mice. And once they're done being experimented on, it's legally they have to be destroyed. They have to be killed. And so, saving these two mice, getting them out of a lab, which he did with the help of one of the scientists. So, it's not like he broke in or anything. Extended the life of these two mice that were used in stem cell research. So the work itself almost becomes a sanctuary for the mice, and they actually are able to sort of enter into culture, which is symbolized by the sound that comes from the wheel. He had to teach them how to dig, how to forage. He had to teach them how to eat seeds, because their form of nutrition would only be in liquid form. They couldn't eat like food that mice out in the wild would eat. So it's a fascinating work, and a work that clearly has to do in some ways with the lives that are used within experimentation and laboratory settings. Then you have something a little more cheeky, a little more fun. You have Banksy, who you likely know. He's a very famous artist, very famous graffiti artist. But he's also an animal rights person. He's done a number of works that have to do with animals. And this one is called Siren of the Lambs. I remember seeing this in New York. It was a truck, an old meat truck that used to carry meat, that he repurposed, and he put in these stuffed toys, stuffed animals, with these strange, like squealing, yelling sounds, and it would drive around New York. This was one of Banksy's, like a guerrilla kind of work, right? And I can show you a clip of it here. that I'm thinking of your reading for today is the idea that getting an image of something horrible, like a slaughterhouse or a factory farm, or whatever it might be, getting that in a form that's more manageable. Here you're getting it almost like a cute sort of way. Allows you to think about it more. Allows you to look. It's an interesting question. And again, if someone ends up writing about the Banksy work here, I'd be curious: is this successful as this sort of guerrilla style work of art, or is it just silly? It's an interesting question. The other artist who's really synonymous with animal rights would be Tsuko, and you'll have learned a little bit about her in today's reading. She's well known. One of her first books. She's a graphic artist, but she also paints. Her first book was called Dead Meat, and she went around the country. I don't know how someone does this. It must be so difficult, but she would go into slaughterhouses and basically draw from life what was happening inside these slaughterhouses. And then it became a book. So she, of everybody, she's I think of everybody we talk about today, she's the most clearly on the side of animal rights, and her work is trying to further animal rights activism. And we get to interesting questions here about, Baker talks about this in your reading for today, what does she add through her graphic work that you couldn't just get from showing, the actual undercover slaughterhouse footage or factory farm footage? What do these drawings do that add to that, or do differently, right, that are somehow more compelling? And maybe create a more reflective space to think about these issues. It's a very interesting thing to think about. So here are some of her other works. This one is called Cruel. It's usually very, very strong, very graphic, her work, often quite violent. So here you're getting the sense of this rapacious capitalist here making all this money on all these bodies, which fundamentally is what the large-scale animal agriculture is all about, right? And then here you have her making fun of the you may not remember, but the Got Milk ads. So you're getting these human babies. It's grotesque. Human babies like sucking at the udder of this emaciated mother who's trying to kiss her calf, and then these calves being killed in the background. So trying to expose the brutalities of the dairy industry, which is it's a very difficult industry, in some ways hard to justify when it's been scaled up so much that you take away a calf from a mother, the calf gets killed, or the calf becomes a milk-producing dairy cow, in this sort of endless cycle. It can be tough to think about, and so this is something Tsuko is definitely trying to make her audience think about. And again, the interesting question here is this effective, or is this simply off-putting? Is it sensational? And are there better ways to raise these issues? Right? These are some of the compelling questions that have to do with these animal rights artists that we're showing. And so in your reading for today, there's Sheep of Fools. So I'm not really going to talk too much about it, because you'll have read about it. There are also a couple other artists in your reading that I just wanted to bring in at the end here. A pretty well-known wildlife photographer, artist, Britta Jachinsky. This is her Ghostly Cheetah, which I think won an award, if I remember from the reading. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so she's, like Ko, she's an animal rights artist, but she's more within the domain of animal rights in the wild, and the ways in which wildlife photography seems to, in all its veracity and all its beauty, actually seems to mask the reality of what the wild is like, and what some of these animals are like. So this is her Ghostly Cheetah, and I almost can't believe you'll read this in the reading that the Natural History Museum, where this was shown, changed the title into something more redemptive. Like they weren't comfortable with ghostly cheetah, the idea of this cheetah being hunted or its habitat being encroached on, and like so many animals out there, becoming in danger of becoming endangered, even extinct. And so how different is this from like a standard, really glossy, beautiful wildlife photography? I just pulled one from the internet, a high-resolution wildlife photographer of this cheetah running through the fields, looking healthy, looking powerful, looking beautiful. You're getting very little context about the real situation of cheetahs, whereas in the ghostly cheetah, there's something a little bit less familiar, and you might think, why is this so dark? Why is he almost like a ghostly apparition evaporating off towards the left there? It's a very different way of showing you the animal than this one, and this one definitely just gives us more reassuring, conventional ways of seeing the cheetah as this fast, wonderful carnivorous cat, big cat, whereas this one doesn't give us the traditional viewpoint, and then we start to our way of seeing gets a little destabilized. And I think this is something Baker likes quite a bit, and Jachinsky also likes quite a bit. And here's another one, this beluga whale from the zoo. A very enigmatic, melancholy, almost tragic kind of photograph. And then we also have Angela Singer. And again, in your weekly writings, you can choose to choose one of these three artists that Baker discusses and develop further in your own thinking. But Angela Singer uses botched taxidermy and like reorders it and makes it both unsettling and beautiful all at once. I suppose it depends on your perspective. And so how different is it from taxonomy you might see at the Natural History Museum in New York, for instance? This is a pretty famous diorama of the Alaskan brown bear. Here, the taxidermy is meant to almost hide itself. Like you're meant to think that you're really seeing a real scene. And furthermore, a diorama like this sort of naturalizes the sense that these bodies should be used in this way and should be put on display. And they don't give you the history of, let's say, the hunting down of the animals. Might very well be a colonial history, a history of Western expansion, so on and so forth. You don't get that. You just get this timeless, beautiful diorama of these bodies that are available to public view, right? This is something that Angela Singer definitely disturbs in the same way that Jachinsky disturbs when it comes to high wildlife photography. And I love this image. I found this too when I was looking. This is the diorama. You're seeing it from the outside, and you almost could mistake it for a painting or something, or a beautiful, like, large color photograph. But in fact, it recesses back in space. These are all actual objects, of course, except for the painted Alaskan mountains. But from time to time, they got to go in and touch up the bears, make sure they're kept up, and so on and so forth. So I find this to be a pretty amazing image. And then this is another work by Angela Singer, which is I found this one to be different than the others because there is something more. There's less off-putting, less kind of disturbing and visceral, and maybe even slightly more. I don't know. It's a little kitschy, but maybe kind of charming in its own way. But maybe that's for you to decide. Okay, so that's it for the Art of Animal Rights. Hope you found it interesting, and we will talk next lecture. Take care.